Hello, my name is Colin Hansen, and it's been really a lifetime honor to be able to be on this stage with these two gentlemen. It's been a very kind of emotional experience to be back here. Just about 26 years ago, I can remember my parents dropping me off right across the way at University Place at South Mid-Quads, my dorm room on the second floor. And I was thinking about how I ended up back on this stage, and certainly Professor Morson is one of the most significant reasons why. I arrived here in 1999 studying to be a sports journalist, and I left writing books about the problem of evil, and I think I blame you for that, and continue to do that.
It's not too late to go back.
It's not too late. But when I think about where we want to go now in this discussion, and I want to make sure that we give the students the primary time. I'll ask a few questions, and we'll give you guys a chance to be able to talk here for the most of our time. Yeah. But I remember thinking that when I came here, I didn't even know. It's amazing to think, okay, well, I come in with all these big questions and I'm going to get answered. I didn't even know what questions I should be asking. And that's part of what that education gave me, and one of the things that Professor Morson gave me there as well. And one last other introductory comment is just thinking about the environment in which we carry on these conversations, especially as our theme tonight about whether there's any basis for hope or optimism in this world. And we all know many, many heavy things that are happening in our world, in this community, on our campus, in all sorts of different ways, and that's made me think back as well to my time here. My sophomore year was the election of 2000, which many of you as undergrads would not obviously remember, not born yet, but was still counting the Chads in South Florida. That was a contentious time. And then right before I was about to get on a plane to come here for my junior year was the 9/11 attack. And so one thing just to encourage you is to think about, there are many ways that our era is unique and difficult, but in many ways it shares more in common with other periods of time that have been difficult over the years. So I want to make sure to give you a chance here to jump in as we continue to process what we've heard from Professor Morson. I think when we talk about hope, it's actually kind of the flip side of what you talked about, Professor Morson, with Dostoevsky and his concern about how we turn everything into just being a product of our environment. We turn people from having freedom into being objects. But I'm wondering, Esau, what is the basis of hope when you can't change your circumstances? I think that's how a lot of young people feel today.
That's a good question. Maybe I'll start by saying, at one point in college, I wanted to study and write about Russian fiction. So this might be my one chance to fire off my Tolstoy hot takes. And believe it or not, I used a line from, I think it's the Inquisitor, in my father's eulogy, where he asked the question, is there anything that our inevitable death does not destroy? And so all that to say is I've always found a kinship with the way in which Russian fiction wrestles precisely with this question of despair. And as I was listening to you talk about the person who went to the front as an atheist and who came back as a believer, I thought about my grandmother, actually my great-grandmother. She was a tenant farmer. Picked cotton in the South. And she was illiterate, but she was deeply religious. And she would come to me and ask me that I said my prayers, and she kind of passed religion down to my family. And I remember when I got to college and I got to university and I started reading all of these books by David Hume, and I'm getting all of this language around questioning the problem of evil. And oftentimes the problem of evil is related to the question of suffering and human suffering, showing that there couldn't be a God. And I got really into that stuff as an undergrad. And then I remembered, and this is going to get to the question of hope, what was it that actually turned me, I came religious, went through the college doubting phase, what actually reshifted me towards something approaching hope? And I thought a lot about my great-grandmother, who didn't have the rhetorical brilliance of some of the people who I'd read in college. But they were talking about the thing, right? And she was in the midst of it. She was the one who was actually going through those things. And so her wrestling with suffering and evil and doubt as a concrete thing, and her conclusion that there was something, a God, that could be a source of comfort to her. I had to take her wrestling and her intellectual, emotional stirring as seriously as I could the people who had the leisure to write about it philosophically. And so it was actually the testimony of people who had suffered. And the question to me was, what was it about what my grandmother believed that allowed her not to be swallowed up by despair in the midst of a Jim Crow South? And I had to say, I had to take her piety as a theologically significant piece of data. And as I ran across the South, right, where I grew up, that same strength was always present in the people who I admired most. And I recognized nihilism hadn't liberated anybody. And so for me, it wasn't simply a pragmatic rejection of nihilism, but it was rooted in the people who I most admired had a sense of hope, moral certainty, and purpose arising from their deep encounter with God that I found compelling, that drew me towards them. And in the same way, it's been something that's been a source of comfort for me. There's a lot more that you could say, but I think there is actually, I'll put it this way, and then I'll give you your thing back. At the center of the African American Christian experience is the question of theodicy, because we come to faith in a land that is marked by chattel slavery. So we've never not wrestled with this real question of why is there evil and why is the evil seeming so unrelenting? And so when I open Russian fiction, even though it was totally different, they're wrestling with this exact same set of questions. So had I been a little bit better and had I had the patience to learn Russian, I might have been doing your job.
Well, you know, when I first came here, there was an African-American novelist. Do people still read Leon Forrest?
I'm not.
Oh, he wrote
But I'm shockingly poorly read.
A wonderful novel called Divine Days. And we would just sit there and talk.
Yeah.
He was getting his way of expressing his themes out of Russian writers.
Yeah.
Because he found the kinship there that he, didn't find in happier people.
Yeah.
Right?
It also makes me think a little bit about Tolstoy's character of Dolly. Could you talk a little bit about prosaic love, how that fits in here?
Yeah, Tolstoy had the idea that what really matters most in life is not the grand, noticeable, dramatic moments and events. That's not what your life is all about. It's the sum total of the tiny events that really matter. And if you live those events right, your life will be meaningful. Whereas you think, well, I'll wait for the big moments. You'll live the big moments wrong too, right? Right? And, the hero of his novel, Anna Karenina, if you mean the person whose values he valued most, is just this ordinary mother, right? Who nobody respects. Well, she's just a mother. What do you want, right? But she lives the small moments, right? She's always thinking of other people, She is the force of fundamental decency that nobody respects. But then we generally don't pay attention to what is really most important. That is the goodness that we have right before our eyes, if we just would do it, the opportunities we have, which are, as Tolstoy would say, they are hidden in plain view, right before you, but that's why they're so hard to see.
You often say that Tolstoy is giving us a hint that we should interpret a character based on how they treat children.
Yeah.
And that's where Dolly comes out. Professor McCaulley, I think of one reason I relate so much to your writing is you talk so much about family.
Yeah.
And I think probably growing up on a farm, I think a lot about family. It was next to my great-grandmother, my grandparents, been in place for a long period of time. And of course, when I'm thinking about family, I'm thinking about children. I'm thinking about my own children.
Yeah.
A necessary condition for preserving hope is resilience.
Yeah.
How do you help cultivate resilience in your own children, and what can the rest of us learn from that?
Yeah, it's funny because my kids are soft, gloriously soft. And I wrestled with this idea because when you grow up and you have to go through something, and there is something that is created in you through the overcoming of that obstacle. We like to say, like, I got it out the mud. And so the ability to fight through something so that you might have a better life creates this sense of the stakes are high. But the point of that is to not live that life anymore. And so if you succeed, then you raise children who don't know what that is like. And I keep telling my kids, you know what it's like, right? And so how do you actually then, without putting your kid, because I'll put it this way, the casualty rate of going through that is too high. So in other words, certain people do make it out, but that doesn't account for all of the people who don't. And so the idea that I'm just going to toss my kids into that same context and hope that they survive isn't a good hope. But I do think there is this thing that is possible, which is like empathy. One of the things that I try to do with storytelling is the reason I wrote a memoir, like, why do you write a memoir? Because, the academics don't like it. They think you're not a serious scholar. What do I care? But when you tell a story, the whole point of that story is to link my children to a bigger story. And there are people who I met in my life, and that after I met them, I can never unsee them. And so after I met my great-grandmother Sophia and my grandmother Wavon and my grandmother and my grandfather who was the pastor, these people had an impact on my life, and they shaped how I viewed the world. But not just those people who succeeded, the people who suffered unjustly and who didn't succeed. And so by introducing those people to my children, I say, are you comfortable in a world that does this to these kinds of people? Or what kind of person are you as a result of having met the people who shaped me? And so part of it is storytelling. There's this interesting part. Can I talk about the Bible? I'm a New Testament scholar.
Yeah.
But I'm going to use the Old Testament. Is that okay? Okay.
Good with me?
There's this repeated refrain in the book of Deuteronomy. It's the book that the people of Israel receive right before they enter into the promised land. And there's a repeated refrain to care for the widow and the orphan, but there's a reason for it. The reason for it is, remember that you were slaves yourselves in Egypt. But that wasn't, most of the people who were there didn't actually have actual experience of slavery. It is saying to think of yourself as a part of the narrative of the people who've experienced something. And even though your situation has changed, you're never separated from those people. And so for me, what I try to do is to link my children to the story of the people of God who've overcome suffering, but that overcoming is not for their own benefit, but for the benefit of those who are behind them. So I'm less interested in making my children resilient in the sense of striving for some middle-class existence. I'm more interested in showing my children that they're responsible. There's a stewardship that they have because of the opportunities they have in life, not to forget about the people who don't have those things. And so what I really want to do is emotionally and spiritually link my children and anybody who reads my work to people who are suffering so they're not forgotten.
Well, go ahead.
I couldn't agree more, and I think I very much think the same way. And it's one of the reasons why, let's say, when I hear a phrase like the American dream, meaning a nice house and being well off and and all the material things, and this, it turns my stomach because that's not what life should be about. It's not bad, of course, but to think that is, to make that a goal, the purpose of living, instead of what you say is, what you can learn by empathy, right? And that's why I think, nothing is better at teaching empathy than great realist fiction, because you live inside the consciousness for hundreds of pages of a person completely unlike yourself, right? Different culture, different gender, different social class, religion, whatever, right? And yet, you suffer when that person suffers, right? And that is a lesson you might bring outside and apply to other people who suffer. You can get it. Take the leap inside their head that you've learned how to do.
Yeah. I had this moment in college. I was a junior, and I'd come home for Christmas break, and even though I'm like a clergy person, I don't have a lot of dramatic religious experiences, maybe like the connection in there. I don't get the audible voices and those kinds of things. But I remember I was sitting in my room, and this question came to me. It almost like erupted from inside of me. And it said, it posed this question, because this might seem strange, but I'd gone from having nothing financially. If you actually grow up poor, dorms are really nice. And the dorm that I was in was nicer than any dorm I had ever had, any room I'd ever stayed in. Had my own room for the first time. Y'all gonna laugh at me. I could go to the cafeteria whenever I wanted, 3 meals a day. Never got that before. I was doing well in school. I was doing well in athletics. And I was coming home from my Christmas break, and I was depressed nonetheless. And this question, and this is sound weird because I'm living in a dorm with 3 meals, but for me, this is like rich living. And the question was, what happens if you received everything you've ever wanted? It's not sufficient to bring you joy. And for me, maybe because I had lower stakes, right? Food and housing was like the highest, like I'd have made it. And I thought that food and housing would feel better than it did. And I found it insufficient. And the thing that has actually given me joy, right, is when I feel most alive when it is in service to someone else. And there's a real sense of joy that kind of erupts from me. I'm sorry, we're ignoring your questions.
No, it's leading.
So I want to say some. I want to say
listen
some
to
more.
me.
I want to say some more about Tolstoy. So I'm thinking about what you said about materialism, and believe it or not, what came to my mind was Flannery O'Connor and the story of the misfit. I use this story all of the time. Have you heard of the misfit? It's okay. Spoiler alert. The misfit deals with this. Trust me, we're going to get to hope. The misfit tells the story of this family that's going on a road trip. Spoiler alert, if you're not ready, you should have read it before now. The misfit pulls this family over, and they take them into the woods. And they're shooting the children one by one and the parents. And the last person who comes out is the grandmother. And the grandmother knows she's about to die. She goes to the misfit, and she starts talking about Jesus. She starts bringing like this religious aspect to it. And the misfit stops her. And the misfit says, don't talk about him because he's the one who messed everything up. Because he's talking about love and forgiveness and all of this stuff. And if what he said is true, there's nothing left to do but to toss away everything and follow him. But what he says is false, there's nothing left in the world but meanness. Then he shoots her in the head. And that's like the end of the story. And the part about that was really interesting, though, which relates to the Russian story that you were telling, is that what Flannery is trying to get at is that it's actually the misfit, not the grandmother, who actually understands the full ramifications of the claim, right? Yeah. He rejects it, but he understands it. Yeah. That there is nothing left. There's nothing but meanness. The reason that's important to me is because as I was having my materialistic moment, in college, I realized that what I really wanted to do was almost become like the grandmother. Embrace enough spiritualism to like push the despair away, but not embrace enough spirituality to make a real difference in my life. And so I think that what most of us end up becoming is like modified materialists. Like nobody wants to actually be Lenin. We want to get in some like hazy hinterland between where there is meaning, but not so much meaning there is a kind of purpose. So do you think, maybe I can ask you this question, is there like a modified materialism that can kind of function in the middle land, or you feel like we're in this misfit or like religiosity opportunity? Is there a hinterland somewhere for us?
Well, there are two meanings of the word materialism, right?
Yeah.
One is simply the philosophical doctrine,
Yes.
there's nothing beyond matter and the laws of nature. The other is, a materialist as someone who values the material things of life. I think in the first definition, if you are a materialist and live it consistently, you will live the way Lenin wants you to. But the second one is not at all incompatible with belief or faith. And it's only if you make it, the goal of your life. But I mean.
So you would say this: anyone who is not linen is not a consistent material, like in the philosophical category. Because I know materialists who don't go around murdering people.
Listen, I know determinists
Yeah.
who feel regret and guilt. But you understand, it makes no sense to be a materialist,
Yes.
to be a determinist and feel regret. Because it couldn't have been otherwise. It means that they don't believe what they think they believe.
Okay.
Okay?
Sorry, you can have your.
Let's,
need to get
let's
that
take let's take it to a contemporary example here. This is a quote that I came across in an essay last year at this time. It was a concluding line in an essay. "It is our soul, not our life, that matters most." That's you writing in First Things last year, May 2024. The context there is Alexei Navalny, the opposition leader to Vladimir Putin, who died. He made that journey from atheist to Christian. Maybe you could expand a little bit more on that last line. It is our soul, not our life, that matters most.
Yeah, I mean, people know of Navalny, right, who was the poisoning of him. And then he, even though he survived this, poison which nobody survived, and, was cured after months, took months, in Germany. And he went back, right? And Natan Sharansky, in Israel, they had read each other, they knew each other's work. And somebody asked, I don't understand, they asked Sharansky, why did he go back? Didn't he know what would happen to him? And indeed, he was arrested and died in a camp. And Sharansky said, I answered her rather rudely. I said, with your view of the world, that nothing matters but your own life and survival and well-being, yes, it made no sense to go back. But he wants to be an example for his people. He wants to say to them, I am not afraid. Don't you be afraid. There was something larger than his self, called his soul, right? And that's what he was living for, right? It takes enormous courage. I mean, if you read the memoirs of Soviet dissidents, some of them are astonishing. I could recommend some for you, what they went through and why. And then Navalny is the one who, in the Putin era, is sort of carrying on that tradition.
Certainly, that's a central contention of Christianity. It also sounds like somebody who's read Dietrich Bonhoeffer.
There we go.
As well. Anything you want to expand on that point?
I mean, I think about Pettus Bridge. So, I got to take you to the South. One of the things that I've always thought really interesting was that we know about the marches that often took place in the South in the 50s and the 60s. They'd often be preceded by worship services. That they would worship first, and then they would go out and march. And the undergirding principle that led to that was motivating the Christian leaders of the civil rights movement was the transformative power of nonviolent sacrificial love. And that both had the opportunity to transform both those who were suffering injustice and those who were inflicting injustice. And what kind of courage does it take to go outside when there's the water hoses? There's this line that I quoted in Reading While Black when they asked one of the women during the I think it was the Montgomery bus boycott, or the Birmingham boycott. I think it was one of the boycotts. And they asked her, how do you feel? And she said, and this is broken English, because she was a maid, she said, my feet is tired, but my soul is rested. She had a sense of inner peace that arose from a confidence that there was a higher a higher value than her own comfort. It was comfortable to accept the place that society had placed for her, but it was a real danger for her to risk her life and her safety. And undergirding all of that was the church that was at the center of that movement. And so for me, I think that one of the things that I always liked about the black church in the South was we had no political power for the most part. We didn't have a lot of economic power. We didn't have the numbers. We didn't have votes. We were disenfranchised. So what do you have? Like, what do you have when you have nothing else? You have the truth of the thing itself. And so all you can rely on in that context is the power of God. And so for me, I've never placed hope in an analysis of the present circumstances. Because at any given moment, the circumstances that never looked good for me, but there's always been like providence, I think, that was guiding us through. And so I think the idea of hope residing from a sense of God's ordering of history has always been a part of my own understanding of the world.